At precisely 7 p.m., a wealthy entrepreneur named Charles Donovan stepped into the lavishly decorated Cressida Lounge, a high-end restaurant renowned for its exclusivity and prestige. Inside, the soft hum of conversation mingled with the clink of fine crystal and the warm glow of chandeliers. Charles was in his element. This was his world. He leaned back in his ergonomic office chair earlier that day, his fingers poised above the keyboard. A satisfied grin crept across his face as he clicked the final send on a deal that had just earned him another fortune. "Another day, another conquest," Charles muttered, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Without turning, Charles barked, "Come in." His assistant, Lisa, entered hesitantly. "Mr. Donovan, your associate Mr. Carter is here to see you." Charles waved dismissively. "Fine, send him in." Carter entered nervously, clutching a tablet. "Sir, I wanted to remind you about tomorrow's dinner at Cressida Lounge. It's the new 5-star restaurant downtown." Charles's eyes sparkled with interest. "Ah yes, the exclusive soirée. Who's expected?" "Well, sir," Carter replied, "it's rumored that the CEO of Horizon Dynamics will be attending. Several others from industries you're looking to break into as well." A slow smile spread across Charles's face. "Perfect. This is exactly the stage I need. By the end of the night, they'll know why Charles Donovan is the name on everyone's lips." "Yes, sir," Carter agreed cautiously. "Oh, and Carter," Charles added sharply, "make sure the rolls is waxed and detailed. I want to arrive in style." "Of course, Mr. Donovan," Carter replied before leaving. Alone, Charles moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The city lights twinkled below, and his chest swelled with pride. This was his empire. Tomorrow it would expand even further. "Watch out, world," he murmured to his reflection. "Charles Donovan is coming for you." Meanwhile, across town, another kind of leader was wrapping up her day. Celeste Harper, CEO of Renewal Ventures, leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her. The day had been long, filled with tough decisions and demanding schedules. Celeste stood, smoothing her understated yet elegant dress. Despite her position, she didn't feel the need to flaunt her success. Her mother's words echoed in her mind: "True power comes from lifting others, not overshadowing them." On her way to the elevator, Celeste passed Maria, one of the evening janitors. "Good evening, Maria," Celeste said warmly. "How's your son adjusting to his new school?" Maria's face lit up. "Oh, Miss Harper, he's loving it. Thank you so much for helping with his scholarship." Moments like these fueled Celeste's drive. It wasn't about prestige or wealth. It was about creating change, one life at a time. Later, Celeste arrived at Cressida Lounge. The maitre greeted her with a respectful nod. "Your usual table, Miss Harper?" "Yes, thank you, Daniel," she replied with a smile. Seated in a quiet corner, Celeste let the day's weight slip away. As she sipped her water, she reflected on her leadership philosophy. For her, success wasn't about numbers or flashy deals. It was about listening, understanding, and making decisions that valued people over profits. Her thoughts were interrupted by a buzz from her phone, a reminder of tomorrow's community outreach program. Celeste smiled, grateful for the opportunity to serve and connect with those in need. Charles Donovan strode into Cressida Lounge later that evening, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. The opulent decor, the aroma of gourmet dishes, the soft chatter of well-dressed patrons. This was his domain. The maitre d' led Charles to his reserved table, and his sharp gaze swept across the room. But as his eyes landed on a lone diner sitting in the corner, something in him bristled. It was Celeste Harper, quietly enjoying her meal. Charles barely recognized her simple elegance amidst the crowd of ostentatious displays. He sneered internally, convinced she didn't belong in a place like this. What he didn't realize was that the woman he looked down upon would soon become the one to challenge everything he thought he knew about success. Charles Donovan's polished smile faltered as his gaze landed on a familiar figure seated quietly at a corner table. Celeste Harper, the reserved and elegant CEO of Renewal Ventures, sipped her water, her eyes distant in thought. Charles's jaw tightened. What was she doing here? This was supposed to be his night to mingle with the elite, to command attention and dominate conversations. Celeste, in her simple dress and absence of flashy jewelry, didn't fit the opulent vibe of Cressida Lounge. Charles settled into his seat, irritation bubbling under the surface. Memories of a similar situation surfaced years ago at another upscale restaurant where he'd sneered at a man in a modest suit who seemed out of place. Back then, Charles dismissed him as an interloper, someone who clearly didn't belong. The memory reinforced his belief. Success should look a certain way. Polished, pristine, powerful. But Celeste's quiet confidence unsettled him. She didn't seek approval or validation from anyone in the room, and her calm presence felt almost defiant. Charles tried to focus on the menu, but his eyes kept wandering back to Celeste's table. Her lack of ostentation seemed to challenge everything he believed about status and success. Annoyance gave way to a simmering frustration, and he couldn't shake the idea that she didn't belong in this temple of luxury. Finally, unable to contain himself, Charles leaned back in his chair and raised his voice, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Can you believe they let just anyone in here these days?" he scoffed, gesturing pointedly toward Celeste's table. Some diners paused, their attention drawn by his outburst. Emboldened by the murmurs around him, Charles continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "I mean, look at her. Does she even know what fork to use?" Nearby patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. Sensing their curiosity, Charles pressed on. "Bet she's here on some charity handout," he added with a sneer. "Probably won a contest or something. There's no way she could afford this place on her own." Celeste, hearing every word, felt a pang in her chest. She recognized Charles immediately. His arrogance and reputation preceded him. But instead of reacting, she chose to remain composed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, willing herself to stay calm. Charles, oblivious to who Celeste truly was, grew more animated. He stood abruptly, his gestures grandiose, as if addressing an audience. "Hey you," he called out, pointing directly at her. "This isn't a soup kitchen, you know. Places like this are for people who've earned their success." Gasps rippled through the restaurant, and the air grew heavy with tension. Waiters froze in their tracks, unsure how to handle the escalating scene. Celeste's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she refused to let her dignity falter. She kept her gaze on her plate, carefully cutting into her steak. The room fell silent, except for the clinking of silverware as patrons exchanged uncomfortable looks. Inside, Celeste wrestled with a swirl of emotions. Memories of past moments of discrimination flooded her mind, each a painful but instructive chapter in her journey. Her mother's advice echoed in her ears. Grace and patience reveal true strength. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for Charles. What had shaped him into someone so blinded by prejudice and arrogance? What pain or insecurity drove his behavior? As Charles's voice grew louder, Celeste whispered to herself, "Stay calm. This isn't about you, it's about him." She took a deliberate bite of her meal, chewing slowly. The desire to stand up and reveal her identity, to watch the realization of his mistake dawn on his face, was tempting. But Celeste knew that wouldn't change his mindset. Real change required understanding, not confrontation. Closing her eyes for a moment, she thought of the many people who had supported her during her rise to success. Mentors, colleagues, and even strangers who believed in her when others doubted her potential. A small smile tugged at her lips as she remembered their kindness. When she opened her eyes, her resolve had hardened. She would not let this man's ignorance define her or ruin her evening. With grace and quiet strength she continued her meal, determined to rise above his venomous tirade. Celeste Harper took a deep breath and sat up straight, her mother's words ringing clearly in her mind. "Your character is revealed in how you treat those who can do nothing for you." With renewed resolve, she continued her meal, ignoring Charles Donovan's taunts and the growing discomfort in the room. Celeste understood that her calm, measured response could leave a far more lasting impression than any heated retaliation. Across the room, Charles sat smugly at his table, convinced he had put her in her place. The warm, ambient lighting and luxurious decor seemed to validate his sense of superiority. He muttered under his breath, stabbing at his filet mignon with exaggerated force. "Unbelievable, they let just anyone in here these days." Charles glanced around the room, expecting nods of approval from other patrons, but he was met only with averted gazes and uneasy silence. Undeterred, he continued his meal, occasionally shaking his head in dramatic disapproval. In his mind, he believed he was doing everyone a favor by pointing out an obvious mistake. The sacred exclusivity of the restaurant was under siege, and he was its self-appointed guardian. At a nearby table, a man quietly observed the scene. Warren Ellis, a composed figure with salt and pepper hair and a discerning gaze, set down his wineglass and dabbed his mouth with his napkin. As the CEO of Horizon Dynamics, the very company Charles hoped to impress, Warren had come to the Cressida Lounge that evening with a specific purpose: to gauge Charles's character in an informal setting. What Warren had witnessed so far was troubling. His sharp ears had caught every condescending remark and every self-righteous mutter. As Warren's eyes drifted to Celeste, who remained dignified despite the barrage of insults, his admiration for her grew. He had known Celeste for years and respected her deeply as a business leader and a person of integrity. Watching her endure Charles's tirade with grace only solidified his high regard for her. With a soft sigh, Warren decided it was time to intervene. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked calmly toward Charles's table. "Excuse me," Warren said, his voice calm but firm, drawing Charles's attention. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments about the lady over there." He gestured toward Celeste with a respectful nod. Charles looked up, surprised and slightly annoyed by the interruption. He had barely noticed Warren earlier, and assumed him to be another patron of little consequence. "I'm Warren Ellis," the man continued, extending a hand, "and I believe we have some business to discuss. But first, I think we should address what's just occurred here." Charles's expression shifted from irritation to shock as recognition dawned. This was the Warren Ellis, the CEO he had been so eager to impress. A cold sweat broke out on Charles's forehead as the gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. Warren pulled up a chair and sat across from Charles, his expression serious but not harsh. "Mr. Donovan," he began, "I think it's time we had a conversation about respect, judgment, and the true meaning of success." Charles's face flushed a deep crimson. The realization that his words and actions had been overheard by someone so significant made his stomach churn. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself speechless. "Before we continue," Warren said evenly, "there's someone I'd like you to meet." He turned and gestured toward Celeste's table. "Miss Harper, would you mind joining us for a moment?" Celeste stood gracefully, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Charles's visible discomfort. As she approached the table, every eye in the restaurant was fixed on her. "Charles Donovan," Warren said, his tone carrying a hint of disappointment, "I'd like to introduce you to Celeste Harper. She's not only a regular patron of this fine establishment, but also the CEO of Renewal Ventures and a key advisor to our organization." The color drained from Charles's face as the full weight of his mistake hit him. The woman he had insulted so freely was not only his professional equal, but someone with immense influence, possibly even more than he had. Celeste extended her hand, her expression neutral, but her gaze steady. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Donovan," she said softly, her voice carrying an unmistakable air of grace and authority. Charles's hand trembled as he shook hers, shame washing over him in waves. He stammered, "I didn't realize. I'm so sorry." The restaurant was utterly silent, every patron watching the scene unfold. Charles felt the weight of their judgment, but more than that, he felt the crushing blow of his own arrogance and short-sightedness. Warren placed a hand on Charles's shoulder, his touch firm but not unkind. "Mr. Donovan, I think this moment is an opportunity for reflection. Your words and actions tonight have revealed a great deal about your character, and not in the way you might have hoped." Charles nodded weakly, his usual confidence completely shattered. He had arrived at Cressida Lounge expecting to impress and dominate the room. Instead, he had been humbled in the most public and painful way imaginable. For the first time, Charles realized that his definition of success might need a drastic overhaul. Celeste Harper extended her hand, her expression calm and composed, though her eyes carried a mix of disappointment and compassion. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, Mr. Donovan," she said softly. Charles Donovan's hand trembled as he accepted the handshake, his mind reeling with shame. Words failed him, his usual confidence shattered. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The restaurant had fallen silent, every patron's gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes time seem to stand still. Warren Ellis placed a steady hand on Charles's shoulder, the gesture firm yet not unkind. "Mr. Donovan," Warren began, his voice calm and deliberate, "this is a moment for reflection. Your words and actions tonight have revealed much about your character, and not in the way you might have hoped." Charles nodded weakly, the enormity of his mistake crashing over him. His arrogance, his prejudice, it had blinded him, leading to a moment that was as humiliating as it was sobering. Warren continued, his gaze steady. "There's something else you should know about Miss Harper." His tone grew gentler but retained its authority. "Celeste is not just a successful CEO, she's one of the most respected philanthropists in our community." Charles's eyes widened, his face draining of color. Each word felt like a blow, further crumbling the ego he had so carefully constructed. "Miss Harper has dedicated significant time and resources to charitable causes," Warren went on. "Her work has transformed countless lives, from funding education programs for underprivileged children to supporting healthcare initiatives for those in need." Charles turned to look at Celeste, who stood silently, her poise unshaken. For the first time, he saw her in a completely different light. The depth of her character, the weight of her contributions, it was all so far beyond the superficial judgments he had made. "In fact," Warren added, his voice carrying a hint of admiration, "Celeste's efforts have been instrumental in bridging gaps between corporations and communities. Her insights and leadership are invaluable to anyone seeking meaningful, responsible expansion." Charles's shoulders slumped under the weight of his realization. He hadn't just insulted a successful businesswoman, he had insulted someone whose work and influence far surpassed his own in both scope and integrity. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. His arrogance and narrow-mindedness had jeopardized not just a critical opportunity, but also his own sense of self-worth. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but no words came. Instead, he sat frozen, small and exposed, utterly foolish in the face of his own misjudgments. The other diners, who had been silent witnesses to his outburst, watched with expressions ranging from pity to second-hand embarrassment. They had been there for his loud declarations, and now they observed the crushing fallout. Celeste, having finished her meal, prepared to leave. She stood and turned toward Warren and Charles, her gaze steady and her voice calm. "Mr. Ellis," she began, offering a polite nod, "it's always a pleasure to see you." Her eyes shifted to Charles, and he seemed to shrink under her penetrating gaze. "And Mr. Donovan," she said, her tone measured but resolute, "I believe I haven't had the chance to introduce myself properly." Charles's face burned as Celeste continued. "I knew who you were the moment you walked in. Your reputation precedes you, both in business and otherwise." The restaurant remained hushed, every patron captivated by Celeste's grace and authority. "I chose not to confront you earlier," Celeste explained, her voice devoid of anger or malice. "Not because I couldn't, but because it wouldn't have been fair to everyone else here. They came for a peaceful evening, not a spectacle." Charles's eyes darted around the room, acutely aware of the attention focused on him. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but nothing came out. Celeste's composure stood in stark contrast to his earlier behavior. Her quiet dignity was a powerful reminder of the qualities he had so recklessly dismissed: strength, grace, and an unwavering respect for others. "I hope," Celeste said softly, her gaze unwavering, "that this experience gives you something to reflect on. Success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves, but about how we treat others along the way." With that, she gathered her purse and jacket, nodding respectfully to Warren and the other diners. As she walked toward the exit, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor echoed in the silent room. At the door, Celeste turned back one last time, meeting Charles's eyes. In her expression, he saw not anger, but a glimmer of hope, a subtle invitation for him to learn and grow from this moment. Without another word, Celeste stepped into the night, leaving Charles to grapple with the painful but necessary truth. He had a long way to go. As Celeste Harper's figure disappeared into the night, Charles Donovan sat frozen at his table, his mind spiraling. The hum of the restaurant seemed to recede into the background as he replayed the scene in his head. Every biting comment, every smug remark, it all felt like a heavy chain now wrapped around his chest. His face burned with shame, and his stomach twisted with the bitter taste of regret. He glanced around the room and noticed the other diners hastily averting their eyes. Their silent judgment pressed down on him like a weight, making it hard to breathe. Charles Donovan, a man who had always prided himself on his business acumen and social prowess, had become the spectacle he thought he was too important to ever be. The very people he sought to impress had seen his arrogance laid bare. As the shock began to fade, Charles's pride reared its head. How dare they look at me like that? How dare they judge me? His fists clenched under the table as anger flared briefly. But as quickly as it had come, a cold realization washed over him. What if I've ruined everything? The partnership he had been so eager to secure now seemed to hang by a thread. Warren Ellis, the CEO he had been trying to impress, had witnessed the entire debacle. Charles's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would Warren still consider working with me? Could this blunder cost me everything I've been working toward? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He looked down at his half-eaten steak, now cold and unappealing. The weight of his actions pressed down on him harder than ever. He loosened his tie, feeling suffocated not just by the fabric but by the enormity of his mistake. For the first time in years, Charles felt genuinely lost. The confidence he had relied on as his armor was gone, leaving him vulnerable and uncertain. After a few moments of internal struggle, Charles took a deep breath and straightened his tie. I have to face this. I have to fix this. With shaky legs, he stood and made his way to Warren's table, his heart pounding louder with each step. "Mr. Ellis," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I have a word with you?" Warren looked up from his dessert, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit down, Mr. Donovan." Charles sank into the chair, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. I want to apologize for my behavior earlier," he began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know who Miss Harper was, but that doesn't excuse how I spoke to her, or about her. It was completely unacceptable." Warren remained silent, his piercing gaze fixed on Charles, who fidgeted under the scrutiny. When Charles finished, Warren set down his spoon and folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Donovan," he said, his tone calm but firm, "while I appreciate your apology, this goes beyond knowing who someone is. Respect and empathy should not be conditional on someone's status or achievements. It's about treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their perceived standing." Charles nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I understand, sir. I realize now how wrong I was." Warren leaned back in his chair, studying Charles with an intensity that made him squirm. After a moment, Warren spoke again. "I believe you need to rethink your approach. Not just to business, but to life. Success isn't measured by money or power. It's about the impact you have on others." Charles sat in stunned silence, Warren's words sinking in deeper than he expected. For the first time in years, he felt himself truly listening to someone else's perspective. Later that evening, Charles trudged into his penthouse, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his thoughts. He tossed his keys onto the marble counter and loosened his tie, the silk feeling like a noose. Pouring himself a glass of scotch, his hands trembled. He stared at the amber liquid for a moment before taking a sip, wincing as the burn mirrored the sting of Warren's words in his mind. Success isn't about climbing social ladders, it's about the impact we have on others. Charles wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering cityscape. Normally, the view filled him with pride, a sense of accomplishment. But tonight, it felt hollow. He saw the skyline as if for the first time, not as a kingdom he had conquered, but as a world he had failed to truly connect with. Memories surfaced, unbidden and sharp. He recalled the hurt in his assistant Lisa's eyes when he dismissed her contributions on a major project. He thought about his younger brother, who had chosen a career as a teacher, and how Charles had mocked him for his lack of ambition. Each memory hit like a punch to the gut, the weight of his arrogance pressing down on him. Had I been wrong all along? He wondered. Was the foundation of my success built on the wrong values? Charles set the glass down and ran a hand through his hair, a sense of unease creeping over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The memory of Celeste Harper's composed face haunted Charles Donovan, as did Warren Ellis's calm but cutting words. Their contrasting reactions to his outburst spoke louder than any reprimand. For the first time in years, Charles felt something he couldn't quite name: doubt. It wasn't just the potential loss of the partnership with Warren that gnawed at him, though that was part of it. A deeper realization tugged at him, one that whispered he might have been measuring success by the wrong standards all along. The next morning, Charles sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. Numbers and charts blurred together as regret and shame clouded his focus. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the thoughts consuming him, but the previous evening replayed over and over in his mind like a tormenting loop. A knock at the door broke his trance. "Come in," Charles called out, his voice hollow. His assistant, Lisa, stepped inside, carrying a stack of reports. "Mr. Donovan, I've got the documents you requested," she said, setting them on his desk. She hesitated, noticing his distracted demeanor. "Is everything all right, sir?" Charles blinked and forced himself to respond. "Yes, everything's fine," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Even as he spoke, he could hear how empty the words sounded. Lisa lingered, concern evident in her voice. "You seem a bit off today." For a moment, Charles considered confiding in her. He thought about explaining the disastrous dinner, his shameful behavior, and the mounting fear of losing everything he'd worked for. But his pride reasserted itself. "I said I'm fine," he snapped, harsher than he intended. Lisa flinched slightly, and Charles immediately felt a pang of guilt. He recognized that look. It was the same one she had given him before, after he had belittled her efforts on a project. That memory, combined with the weight of his current shame, only deepened his discomfort. "Of course, sir," Lisa replied softly, turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Charles slumped in his chair, feeling worse than before. He knew he owed her an apology, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned back to his computer, determined to bury himself in work and avoid confronting the storm inside him. Charles's restless thoughts eventually returned to Celeste. He knew he needed to apologize, not just for the sake of salvaging the partnership, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet the idea of reaching out filled him with dread. He picked up his phone, only to set it down again moments later. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I was a jerk," didn't feel adequate. Every time he pictured Celeste's calm, steady gaze, it made him feel even smaller. Unable to sit still, Charles paced his office, running his hands through his hair. He knew he couldn't put this off any longer. Something inside him had shifted, and for once, his drive wasn't fueled by ambition or fear of failure. It was a genuine desire to make things right. Returning to his desk, he opened his laptop and began drafting an email to Celeste. He poured his thoughts into the message, carefully crafting an apology that he hoped would convey the depth of his regret. But as he hovered over the send button, doubt crept in. The words on the screen seemed hollow and insufficient. How could a few sentences possibly express how deeply he regretted his actions? Frustrated, Charles deleted the email and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed to do something more meaningful, something that would show he truly understood the gravity of his mistake. The thought of facing Celeste in person made his palms sweat. What if she refused to forgive him? Worse, what if she met his apology with the same calm disappointment she had shown the night before? He considered sending flowers with a handwritten note, but it felt too impersonal. Asking Warren to arrange a meeting seemed equally out of the question. Charles wrestled with these thoughts, each option feeling more daunting than the last. As the days passed, his anxiety grew. It clung to him like a dark cloud, weighing down his once confident demeanor. He canceled meetings, skipped social events, and retreated into his office, which now felt more like a sanctuary from the world. The bustling energy that had once defined his workspace was gone. The awards and accolades lining his shelves felt meaningless in the face of his growing regret. Charles spent hours staring blankly at his desk, lost in his thoughts. He couldn't avoid the truth any longer. If he wanted to move forward, he needed to face his mistakes head-on. But the question remained: how? Charles Donovan stared blankly at the wall of his office, the ticking clock on his desk growing louder with every passing second, mocking his inaction. The weight of his unresolved situation with Celeste Harper pressed heavily on him, making even simple tasks feel impossible. The intercom buzzed, and Lisa's voice crackled through. "Mr. Donovan, another call from Vanguard Enterprises. Shall I put it through?" Charles sighed, his voice devoid of its usual authority. "Tell them I'm in a meeting." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he stopped at Celeste's name. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he couldn't press it. Each passing day made the burden heavier, the memory of that humiliating night playing on repeat in his mind. He could still see the hurt in Celeste's eyes, the quiet disappointment in Warren's expression, and the silent judgment from the other diners. The image of his own behavior, loud and condescending, felt like a weight around his neck. His confidence, once unshakable, had been replaced by an unsettling fear of confrontation. Charles began questioning everything. Had his judgment always been this flawed? The longer he avoided addressing his mistake, the more insurmountable it felt. The office he once considered a sanctuary now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him. The accolades and awards on his shelves seemed to mock him, a testament to a success built on arrogance and disregard for others. With a deep breath, Charles stood outside the sleek glass doors of Renewal Ventures. His heart pounded, and his palms were clammy. He'd spent the entire morning rehearsing what to say, but now, faced with the reality of seeing Celeste, his carefully prepared words evaporated. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, straightening his tie and squaring his shoulders. With a trembling hand, he pushed the doors open and stepped into the lobby. The receptionist greeted him politely, and Charles felt a pang of guilt as he recalled how he might have treated someone in her position just weeks ago. Clearing his throat, he said, "I'm Charles Donovan. I have an appointment with Miss Harper." The elevator ride to Celeste's office felt like an eternity. Each floor added to his doubts. What if she refused to see him? What if his apology made things worse? When the doors opened, Charles stepped out, his legs feeling heavy. Celeste's assistant looked up from her desk as he approached. "Mr. Donovan, Miss Harper will see you now," she said, gesturing toward the office door. Charles nodded, his mouth dry as he approached the door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a fleeting moment, he considered turning back, fleeing from this confrontation. But he knew he had to face this. The door creaked open and Celeste's calm voice greeted him. "Come in." Charles stepped into the office, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. Celeste sat behind her desk, her expression neutral, her posture poised. The room seemed impossibly large as Charles walked toward her desk, the short distance feeling like a marathon. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Celeste nodded, her eyes steady on his. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Donovan." Charles sank into the chair across from her, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. This was his chance to make things right, to show that he understood the gravity of his behavior. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The silence in the room felt deafening, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Charles's hands fidgeted in his lap as he opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Celeste waited patiently, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush him, allowing him the time to gather his thoughts. "Miss Harper," Charles finally said, his voice shaky, I want to apologize for my behavior at the restaurant." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "What I did was inexcusable." His eyes darted around the room, unable to meet hers. Taking a deep breath, he pressed on. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night," he said, his words spilling out in a rush. "I realize now how wrong I was, not just in what I said, but in how I've been treating people in general." Charles's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've always prided myself on being self-made, on my success, but I see now that my pride turned into arrogance. I've been looking down on others without even realizing it." Finally, he looked up and met Celeste's gaze. Her calm, steady eyes seemed to pierce through him. "I'm truly sorry for the pain and embarrassment I caused you," Charles said earnestly. "I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, to being better." Throughout Charles's stumbling apology, Celeste remained silent. Her face was composed, her expression unreadable. She listened intently, giving him the space to say everything he needed to. As the clock ticked on, Charles felt the weight of her silence, wondering what she might say next. He only hoped that his words had conveyed the depth of his regret. Celeste Harper's calm yet firm response to Charles Donovan's apology hung heavily in the air. As he finished his stumbling explanation, she let the silence linger, her composed demeanor contrasting starkly with his nervous energy. Finally, Celeste spoke, her voice steady and measured. "Mr. Donovan, I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," she said. "But words alone aren't enough. Real change comes from action." Charles nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. He knew she was right, though the truth stung more than he'd expected. Celeste continued, "Our partnership is important, but I'm putting it on hold for now. I need to see genuine change in your behavior before we move forward." His heart sank. He had feared this outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all the more final. "I understand," he said softly. "Is there anything I can do to prove myself?" Celeste regarded him thoughtfully. "Actually, there is," she said. "I support an orphanage downtown. They're always in need of volunteers. I think spending some time there might be an eye-opening experience for you." Charles blinked, caught off guard. "An orphanage?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Celeste nodded. "It's a chance to see firsthand the impact of inequality and the importance of empathy. It won't be easy, but it could be valuable." The idea of volunteering at an orphanage was far outside Charles's comfort zone, but as he met Celeste's steady gaze, he realized this might be his only path to redemption. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it. When do I start?" A small, knowing smile touched Celeste's lips. "I'll make the arrangements. Thank you for being willing to try, Mr. Donovan. It's a good first step." The next day, Charles stood in front of a modest brick building. His designer shoes clicked against the worn linoleum floors as he entered the orphanage. The faint smell of disinfectant and old books filled the air, mingling with the sound of children's laughter echoing from another room. A kind-faced woman approached him, her smile warm and welcoming. "You must be Mr. Donovan," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Mrs. Carter, the head caretaker. We're so glad to have you here." Charles shook her hand stiffly, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "Thank you. I'm not exactly sure where to start," he admitted. Mrs. Carter chuckled. "That's all right. Let's introduce you to the children. They're always excited to meet new people." As they entered the playroom, a dozen curious faces turned toward Charles. The children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, wore clothes that were slightly worn but clean. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Everyone, this is Mr. Donovan," Mrs. Carter announced. "He's here to volunteer with us." A chorus of shy hellos greeted him, but Charles felt a lump in his throat. He looked at the children's bright but cautious eyes, feeling the weight of his privilege pressing down on him. "Hi," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. A little girl with braids tugged on his sleeve. "Do you want to play blocks with me?" she asked. Charles hesitated, unsure how to respond. He couldn't remember the last time he had played with blocks, or with any child for that matter. I suppose I could," he said, lowering himself to the floor awkwardly. As he sat among the children, the realization of how many people like them he had dismissed in his life began to sink in. A boy with a scar on his cheek handed him a wooden block. "You can put it on top," the boy said shyly. Charles took the block, his hands trembling slightly, and placed it on the tower. He glanced at his expensive watch, the stark contrast between his wealth and the children's modest surroundings making his chest tighten with shame. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked around at the eager faces watching him. Each child carried a story he couldn't begin to imagine. For the first time in years, Charles Donovan felt truly humbled. As the days passed, Charles found himself returning to the orphanage more often. His initial discomfort began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of connection with the children. He watched in awe as they played, laughed, and supported one another despite their challenging circumstances. One afternoon, while helping with homework, Charles noticed a boy sitting alone in the corner. The child's dark eyes were filled with a wariness that seemed far beyond his years. "That's Liam," Mrs. Carter whispered. "He's had a tough time trusting people. Maybe you could try talking to him." Charles nodded, a flutter of nervousness in his stomach as he approached the boy. Liam's eyes narrowed, a look of suspicion that reminded Charles of the glances he had given those he deemed beneath him. "Hi, Liam," Charles said softly. "Would you like some help with your homework?" Liam shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "I can do it myself." Charles felt a pang of recognition. He had spent so much of his life pushing others away, insisting he didn't need anyone's help. "I'm sure you can," Charles replied gently, "but sometimes it's nice to have company." For a moment, Liam hesitated. Then, with a small nod, he gestured for Charles to sit beside him. As Charles settled in, he realized this wasn't just about helping Liam, it was about learning from him too. For the first time, Charles began to understand the resilience it took to navigate a world that wasn't always kind. Charles Donovan recognized a glimmer of himself in Liam, the wary, quiet boy at the orphanage, who seemed to carry a world of pain in his small frame. Each time Charles offered to help, Liam's guarded demeanor pushed him back. But Charles persisted, sensing that beneath the boy's defensive walls lay a depth of wisdom and resilience that was humbling. One afternoon, as Charles approached Liam, he tried a different approach. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked softly. Liam shrugged, his eyes fixed on the window. Charles sat down, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between them, comfortable at first, then heavy with unspoken thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, Liam spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep trying?" Charles blinked, caught off guard. I want to help," he stammered, his confidence faltering. Liam turned to face him, his young eyes holding a depth of understanding far beyond his years. "You don't know what it's like," Liam said, his voice tinged with weariness, "to be judged before anyone even knows you." The words struck Charles like a blow to the chest. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't. Can you tell me?" Liam hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. But something in Charles's tone convinced him to speak. He began to share his story, of cruel words from classmates, suspicious stares from strangers, and the unshakable feeling of not belonging. "It's like being invisible and too visible at the same time," Liam explained, his voice trembling slightly. "People see what they want to see, not who I really am." As Liam spoke, Charles listened intently. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just hearing words, he was truly listening. The boy's story unfolded like a mirror reflecting Charles's own actions, the dismissive glances, the judgments he had made without thought, the pain he had caused without realizing. "I'm so sorry, Liam," Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been one of those people, judging others without knowing them, without even trying to understand." Liam looked at him, his eyes searching for sincerity. "Why?" he asked simply. Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought it made me better, stronger, but I was wrong, so wrong." The boy studied him for a moment, then turned back to the window. But the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly, and Charles felt a faint sense of hope. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, warming the room as Charles and Liam sat side by side. Something shifted in Charles during that moment. The walls he had spent years building, walls to keep others out and to protect his carefully curated image, began to crack. For the first time, he understood what true strength looked like. It wasn't about power, wealth, or control. It was about vulnerability, resilience, and the courage to connect with others. Charles left the orphanage that day with a heavy heart, but a clearer purpose. Liam's story stayed with him, its echoes breaking down the last remnants of his arrogance. At home, Charles paced his living room, replaying the conversation in his mind. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror and paused, really looking at his reflection. The man staring back at him looked tired, uncertain. A far cry from the confident businessman he had always prided himself on being. "Who am I?" Charles whispered to his reflection. "And how did I become this person?" The question lingered as he thought back to his childhood. His family had struggled, and success had always seemed like the ultimate escape. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that leaving it all behind, his past, his roots, his vulnerabilities, was the only path forward. But now, faced with Liam's quiet strength, Charles wondered if he had been running from the wrong things all along. Sitting down heavily on his couch, he buried his face in his hands. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, mistaking it for progress. But while Liam's walls had been for survival, Charles's walls had been for exclusion, for keeping others at a distance and maintaining an illusion of superiority. The next day, Charles arrived at the orphanage with his shoulders slumped, the weight of his ongoing struggle etched on his face. He spotted Liam sitting alone by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the light. Taking a deep breath, Charles approached him. "Mind if I sit with you again?" he asked. Liam shrugged, but didn't protest. Charles settled into the chair next to him, unsure of what to say. After a few moments, Liam turned to him, his expression serious. "Do you really think people can change?" The question caught Charles off guard. He hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I think people can change if they really want to. But it's not easy. It takes time and effort." Liam looked at him, his eyes probing. "Why do you think you can?" Charles exhaled, feeling the weight of the question. "Because I'm trying. And because of you, Liam, you've shown me things I didn't want to see about myself, and I don't want to be that person anymore." Liam's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time Charles thought he saw a glimmer of trust. The sun streamed in through the window, and the two sat in silence, the warmth of the light wrapping around them. In that moment, Charles knew he was beginning to change, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Charles Donovan began to truly grasp the ripple effect of his past actions. He saw the harm caused by prejudice and judgment reflected in the brave, resilient children at the orphanage, especially Liam. The boy's quiet strength continued to humble him, chipping away at the arrogance that had once defined his life. Over time, Charles found himself more involved in the orphanage's daily life. The awkwardness he had initially felt melted away, replaced by a genuine eagerness to contribute. One morning, Charles arrived early to help with breakfast. As he stirred a large pot of oatmeal, he noticed a young girl struggling to reach the bowls on a high shelf. Without hesitation, he walked over and lifted her up, steadying her as she grabbed one. "Thank you, Mr. Charles," she said, beaming up at him with a gap-toothed smile that warmed his heart. "You're welcome," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Throughout the day, Charles immersed himself in various activities. He helped the children with homework, played tag in the yard, and even learned to braid hair from one of the older girls. Each interaction, no matter how small, seemed to chip away at the walls he had built around himself for so many years. During lunch, Charles sat with a group of children, listening intently as they shared their dreams. One boy said he wanted to be a doctor, another a teacher. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in years, Charles found himself invested in someone else's aspirations. "You know," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice, "I believe you can do anything you set your minds to." The children's faces lit up with hope, and something shifted inside Charles. Despite their challenges, they exuded resilience, kindness, and an optimism that inspired him deeply. Later that afternoon, Charles found himself sitting with Liam again. This time, the silence between them felt different, no longer awkward but companionable. "Mr. Charles," Liam said softly, breaking the quiet, "do you think people can really change? Can they learn to see past, the outside stuff?" Charles looked at Liam, his heart heavy. He saw not just the boy, but all the people he had misjudged throughout his life. He thought about his journey, how much his perspective had shifted in such a short time. "Yes, Liam," he replied, his voice filled with newfound conviction. "I believe they can. Because I'm learning to. Every day I'm here with you all." As Charles's time at the orphanage drew to a close, he sat on a bench in the playground, watching the children play. Laughter filled the air, and he couldn't help but smile. It was hard to believe how much had changed in just a few weeks. He thought back to his first day, how out of place and uncomfortable he had felt. Now the orphanage felt like a second home. He had learned the children's names, their fears, and their dreams. In doing so, he had learned so much about himself. His gaze landed on Liam, who was helping a younger child climb the monkey bars. The sight filled Charles with warmth. He remembered their first awkward interactions and marveled at how far they had come. Liam had taught him more about courage and resilience than any business deal ever could. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the playground, Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He realized how much he would miss this place and these children. The thought of leaving made his heart ache in a way he had never experienced before. But along with the sadness, there was something else. A profound sense of gratitude. This experience had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had come here thinking he was doing the children a favor, but in reality, they had given him so much more. Charles stood and brushed off his pants, walking toward the building with a silent promise in his heart. This wouldn't be the end. He would stay involved and continue making a difference in the children's lives. For the first time, Charles felt truly humble. He realized that all his business success meant little if he couldn't use it to help others. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a genuine desire to connect with and understand people from all walks of life. When Charles stood outside Celeste Harper's office once again, he took a deep breath to steady his nerves. This time, as he knocked on the door, he felt different, humbled but purposeful. "Come in," Celeste's calm voice called. Charles stepped inside, and Celeste looked up from her desk. Her eyes met his, and she immediately noticed the change in him. The arrogance that had radiated from him before was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. "Miss Harper," Charles began, his voice soft but clear, "thank you for giving me the opportunity to volunteer at the orphanage. It's been, well, life-changing." Celeste gestured for him to sit, remaining silent as he continued. "I've learned so much," Charles said, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Those children, they've taught me more about resilience, kindness, and the true meaning of success than I ever thought possible." As Charles Donovan spoke, Celeste Harper listened intently. She could hear the sincerity in his voice and see the genuine transformation in his demeanor. The man sitting before her was unrecognizable from the one who had caused a scene in the restaurant weeks ago. "I realize now how narrow my view of the world was," Charles admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I judged people based on such superficial things. But those kids, they showed me what really matters." Celeste leaned forward, her expression softening. "Can you tell me more about your experience, Charles? What specifically did you learn?" Charles's face lit up as he began to recount his time at the orphanage, especially his interactions with Liam. He spoke of the children's resilience, their dreams, and how they had opened his eyes to the realities of discrimination and hardship. As Celeste listened, she couldn't help but feel impressed. The change in Charles was undeniable. His words no longer carried the weight of arrogance, but instead reflected a genuine empathy and understanding. When Charles finished sharing his experiences, Celeste took a moment to let his words sink in. She could see the profound impact the orphanage had on him, and it touched her heart. "Charles, I'm truly impressed by the change I see in you," Celeste said warmly. "It takes a lot of courage to confront our own biases and work to overcome them." Charles nodded, a mix of relief and gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Miss Harper. I can't express how much this experience has meant to me." Celeste leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "I believe you've learned a valuable lesson, Charles, one that will serve you well in both your personal and professional life." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I think we can move forward with the partnership," she said, causing Charles's eyes to widen in surprise and hope. "Really?" Charles asked, barely able to contain his excitement. Celeste held up a hand, her expression turning serious. "Yes, but with a new understanding between us. Our relationship, both personal and professional, must be based on mutual respect and shared values. Can you commit to that?" Without hesitation, Charles replied, "Absolutely, Miss Harper. I wholeheartedly agree. I promise to carry the lessons I've learned with me in everything I do." Celeste stood and extended her hand. "Then, let's move forward together, Charles. I believe this partnership can do great things, not just for our businesses, but for our community as well." As Charles shook her hand, he felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. This was more than just a business deal. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with empathy, understanding, and the desire to make a positive impact on the world. The partnership between Charles and Celeste's companies blossomed, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. Their collaboration brought fresh perspectives to both businesses, leading to innovative solutions and greater success. True to his word, Charles remained committed to his personal growth. He continued volunteering at the orphanage, spending time with Liam and the other children whenever his schedule allowed. These visits served as a constant reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding in every aspect of life. Celeste noticed the positive changes in Charles's leadership style. He became more attentive to his employees' needs, fostering a more inclusive and supportive work environment. This shift not only improved morale, but also led to increased productivity and creativity within his company. As their partnership grew stronger, Charles took a more active role in Celeste's philanthropic efforts. He used his business acumen and resources to help expand the reach of her charitable projects. Together, they launched initiatives to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged youth and support small businesses in disadvantaged communities. One day, as they discussed a new community outreach program, Charles turned to Celeste with a grateful smile. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd say this, but that night at the restaurant was the best thing that could have happened to me." Celeste nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our most difficult moments," she replied. "I'm proud of how far you've come, Charles." Charles's commitment to becoming a better person and leader never wavered. He sought out opportunities to grow, attending workshops on diversity and inclusion and encouraging his employees to do the same. Over time, he became known not just for his business success, but also for his integrity and compassion. As the months passed, the partnership between Charles and Celeste became a model for ethical business practices in their industry. Their collaborative approach and focus on social responsibility attracted like-minded partners and clients, further strengthening their market position. One evening, as the sun set, Charles, Celeste, and Warren arrived at the orphanage for the annual charity event. The courtyard was decorated with colorful balloons and streamers, and the air buzzed with excitement. Charles felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Liam grinning up at him. "You came!" Liam exclaimed, his eyes shining with joy. "Of course I did, buddy," Charles replied, ruffling Liam's hair affectionately. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." As the event continued, Charles found himself surrounded by the children he had grown to care for deeply. Their laughter and enthusiasm filled him with a profound sense of gratitude. From a distance, Celeste and Warren watched, both deeply moved by the genuine happiness on Charles's face. "It's incredible how much he's changed," Warren remarked quietly. Celeste nodded, her smile warm. "It just goes to show that with the right guidance and a willingness to learn, anyone can grow." As the evening drew to a close, Charles stood in the courtyard, watching the children say goodbye to the guests. His heart was full, and he marveled at how different his life had become. Celeste approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. Charles turned to her, his eyes misty with emotion. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am," he said softly, "for that night at the restaurant, for the second chance you gave me. For all of this." "You've learned some valuable lessons, Charles," Celeste replied, "about humility, empathy, and the power of grace." Charles nodded, his gaze drifting back to the children. "I never imagined I could change so much," he admitted. "But being here, working with you and Liam, it's opened my eyes to what really matters in life." As the last guests departed, Charles stood surrounded by the children, their faces glowing with love and admiration. Liam stepped forward, wrapping his arms around Charles in a tight hug. "Thank you for being our friend," Liam said, his voice muffled against Charles's shirt. Charles hugged him back, a lump forming in his throat. Looking up, he saw Celeste and Warren watching with pride. In that moment, he knew his journey was far from over, but he felt ready, filled with hope and a deep sense of purpose. As the courtyard buzzed with excitement, Charles Donovan felt a tug on his sleeve. Looking down, he saw Liam grinning up at him, his eyes shining with joy. "You came!" Liam exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "Of course I did, buddy," Charles replied, ruffling Liam's hair affectionately. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Throughout the evening, Charles found himself surrounded by the children he had come to know and care for over the past months. They laughed, shared stories, and played games together. The connection he felt with them filled his heart in a way he had never experienced before. From a distance, Celeste Harper and Warren Blake watched the scene unfold. It's amazing how much he's changed, Warren remarked quietly, his tone tinged with admiration. Celeste nodded, a warm smile gracing her face. It just goes to show that with the right guidance and a willingness to learn, anyone can grow. As the event drew to a close, Charles stood off to the side, watching as the children said their goodbyes to the guests. His heart was full, and he marveled at how different his life had become. Celeste approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked with a kind smile. Charles turned to her, his eyes misty with emotion. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am," he said softly. "For that night at the restaurant, for the second chance you gave me, for all of this." He gestured around the courtyard, taking in the laughter and joy that filled the air. "You've learned some valuable lessons, Charles," Celeste replied, "about humility, empathy, and the power of grace." Charles nodded, his gaze drifting back to the children. "I never imagined I could change so much," he admitted, "but being here with these kids, working with you and Warren, it's opened my eyes to what really matters in life." As the last of the guests departed, Charles found himself surrounded once more by the children. Their faces beamed with love and admiration, filling him with a deep sense of purpose. Liam stepped forward, wrapping his small arms around Charles's waist in a tight hug. "Thank you for being our friend," Liam said, his voice muffled against Charles's shirt. Charles felt a lump form in his throat as he hugged Liam back. Looking up, he saw Celeste and Warren watching the scene with proud smiles. In that moment, Charles knew his journey of growth was far from over, but he was filled with hope for the future and a profound sense of purpose. As the courtyard emptied and the evening's festivities ended, Charles walked toward the gate, his heart lighter than it had been in years. His journey had taught him that true success wasn't measured by wealth or power, but by the lives he could touch and the positive change he could create. Would you forgive someone as easily as Celeste did after being publicly humiliated? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Your support keeps these heartwarming stories coming. Thank you for watching. Music fades out as the screen displays a final message of gratitude.